the 16th of April each year, people around the world recognise the anniversary of the battle at Culloden. This battle ended the rising led by Charles Edward Stuart and had profound implications in Scotland and elsewhere. If you ever have the chance to be at Culloden on the nearest Saturday to the 16th of April, please do so. The gathering that morning, the emotion and the history are worth sharing. At the beginning of April 1746, government forces were gathered around Aberdeen and experiencing a major training period as they prepared for what they hoped would be the final confrontation with the Jacobite army of Charles Edward Stuart. The government had seen the Jacobites retreat from England and now in control of most of central Scotland, the east coast and most of the far north. In addition to the government army, they had some 5,000 troops from Hesse in reserved stations around Stirling and Perth. The Royal Navy, whose influence in affairs was becoming more important, was now patrolling the coast on the east and west and even within the Moray Firth. The Jacobite army, led by Prince Charles, who was slowly recovering from pneumonia, was centred around Inverness. Men who had been involved in action around Atholl and Blair and trying to take Fort William by siege had been recalled and were on their way back to Inverness. The men who had been sent under Perth and Kilmarnock to chase Lord Loudon from the area north of Dornoch were gathering and making their way slowly southward. Forces were clearly gathering for a major, perhaps final, battle. For some 5 or 6 weeks, the main government army, commanded by King George's second son, the Duke of Cumberland, had been involved in intensive training near Aberdeen. The aim was greater speed of musket fire, improved use of bayonet, and crucially, more rigid discipline and confidence to enable them to face the Highland charge, which was expected to come from the Jacobite army. This had been a significant element of defeat of the government forces at Preston Pans and at Falkirk Muir. It had also been witnessed by Cumberland himself when the army was led. He was defeated at Fontenoy early in 1745. Finishing their training, the army set off from Aberdeen on April the 8th, heading west towards the Jacobites, who were largely gathered near Inverness. The main force reached Banff the next day, and on the 11th arrived at the major river crossing of the Spey. Some 2,500 Jacobites, including cavalry, lowland troops, and about half of the French brigade, had arrived on the west bank of the Spey under Drummond, and were planning to hold up the government advance. However, threatened by the size of the enemy force and the possibility of being outflanked by government troops crossing the Spey further upstream, they retreated towards Inverness. At first, the government army feared that the retreat might be a feint, designed to draw them into a trap. But finding that it was not, they crossed the Spey in force on April the 12th and proceeded to Nairn, where on the 14th of April they were joined by the Duke of Cumberland and all his senior officers. April the 15th was the Duke's birthday, and in recognition, drink was issued to all his men, and they celebrated and rested before the expected battle. During the first 2 weeks of April, Jacobite forces around Inverness were slowly being joined by men travelling back from actions in the west and in the south of Scotland, and their numbers were slowly increasing. With that growth in numbers came more serious problems of supply. They were running out of food and, crucially, money. Men had not been paid for some time, and Charles saw it as important to support his father's claim to the throne by paying his men and, wherever possible, buying the supplies they needed. Having fallen back from most of the towns once occupied, they could no longer collect taxes. How they could have benefited from the £12,000, some £2 million today, which had been lost to them when the Royal Navy ships had prevented Le Prince Charles, the ship, landing on the east coast. Gathering his men around Inverness, Prince Charles was now aware that the Duke of Cumberland was in Nairn and within a few hours' march of Inverness. He also had to deal with, as on numerous occasions since July the previous year, the differing advice from his senior advisers, especially as usual between Lord George Murray and the now Adjutant General O'Sullivan. Both had been with Charles almost throughout the Rising. O'Sullivan, a Franco-French officer, had actually been one of the very small group of men landing with Charles back in July 1745. The two men had clashed on many occasions, Murray even being accused by O'Sullivan at one time of being a government supporter and trying to undermine the prince. Now they argued about the place where the Jacobites should face the government forces in the now imminent battle. Learning of the government army being at Nairn and of the birthday celebrations, the decision was made to make a surprise night attack on the government camp on the night of the 15th to the 16th of April. This was supported by Charles Edward Stuart, and they set off from Inverness in 2 columns. They set off late to avoid being observed by the ships of the Royal Navy, which were patrolling the Murray Firth. Planning was poor, and communication between the columns was almost non-existent. At 2 a.m., Murray, who was leading one column, realized that they were still some 4 miles away from the enemy camp and that dawn was not far away, so he decided to turn back. When they finally learnt of this, the other column had no alternative other than to do the same. Exhausted men trudged back towards Drumossie Moor. Some even stopped and slept by the track. Others collapsed on their return, tired, hungry, and demoralized. The details of the Battle of Culloden, which may possibly be called the Battle of Drumossie Moor, have been recorded in dozens of books, depicted in movies and TV programmes, and is very well explained in the National Trust for Scotland's Visitors Centre on the battlefield site. This section will only be a summary of events. The first issue is to consider why the battle took place where it did. This was primarily a choice for the Jacobites, and yet again, Prince Charles was faced with contradictory advice again from O'Sullivan and Murray. Murray argued that the field at Culloden was not suitable for the Highland charge, being in parts too wet and overgrown. O'Sullivan said the ground would be more disadvantageous to government cavalry and artillery. Murray argued that meeting the government army at Dull Cross, about 3 miles east where the airport is now, would give the Jacobites an advantage, but O'Sullivan vetoed this. There was a case for moving the army across the River Nairn onto the slopes of Drumossie Moor, allowing the charge to be downhill. But this would have allowed the government army to bypass the Jacobites, and an examination of this area will show it does not have the advantages supposed. They could go directly into Inverness and capture the last Jacobite stronghold with its stores, etc., which would have been a major strategic loss. Of course, one could argue that they should have avoided battle altogether. A retreat further north may have given the chance for consolidation, recruitment, and perhaps French help. But short of money and supplies and unsure of the level of support for the further north, this was rejected. In the end, the debate was ended for the Jacobites by the imminent arrival of government forces. As the men, exhausted from the aborted night march, tried to rest and their leaders argued around Culloden House, they heard the sound of over 200 kettle drums as the government approached from the direction of Nairn. They had no more time for debate and formed their lines across Culloden Moor. The urgency also meant that Prince Charles had no opportunity to hold his customary council of war on the morning of the 16th of April. The debate that day raises another what if, which could have impacted on the outcome of the Rising. We will examine this alternative history in a separate section. Early on the morning of April the 16th, 1746, some 5,500 Jacobites were aligned on the western end of the field. Most were hungry, and many were exhausted from the aborted night march. The army included only some 200 cavalry and about 12 pieces of artillery. The government army left Nairn in the early hours of the morning to march the 12 miles or so to Culloden. They were generally well fed and rested, consisting of some 7,000 in all. The government army included many more horsemen and a larger number of artillery pieces. Their alignment on the eastern edge of the battlefield was completed by noon. The first shots were fired by Jacobite cannon with little impact, but the response by government guns was devastating, especially when they changed from firing cannonballs to using coehorn mortars with shells that burst in the air above the Jacobites. Having been instructed to await the order to charge, the Jacobites stood and suffered this barrage for some minutes before they were unleashed to charge across the field. They may have moved sooner, but one messenger sent to start the charge was beheaded by a cannonball. The state of the ground, and even now one can see the pools and ditches at that end of the field, meant that those on the left of the line moved to the right. The full impact of the Highland charge was thus reduced, as the full force of the charge did not reach the government lines en masse. Even so, many Jacobites did reach their enemy, and although some did break through the front line, the government forces did not collapse as had happened on earlier occasions. In fact, the breakthrough on the right of the Jacobite line, coupled with the Jacobites being more bunched together, resulted in a much more concentrated target for the second line of the government forces when they moved forward with devastating musket fire. Cumberland's extra training and the confidence and discipline of his men had paid off. In a few minutes, at this critical time, some 700 Jacobites were killed or wounded. The attack faltered and the army started to pull back. Within a very short time, they were fleeing across the field, pursued by government foot soldiers and cavalry. Less than 1 hour had elapsed between the first shot by Jacobite cannon and the panicked flight. The Jacobites had lost some 1,500 men in the battle, and about 400 were taken prisoner. The government army recorded only 50 deaths and less than 300 wounded. The battle was over, the only battle which the Duke of Cumberland ever won, and the only battle which Charles Edward Stuart lost. As the Jacobites fled from the field, some southward over the river Nairn and some others down the road towards Inverness, they were pursued by government forces. Many were killed when caught, others taken prisoner, often to be shot later. On the battlefield itself, many wounded Jacobites were killed where they lay, and the dead were robbed, stripped, and left on the field. Most laid there for days before bodies were collected and interned in a communal grave. Clan members and those not part of any clan were not separated. The clan markers which can be seen today on the field are in reality memorial stones rather than clan grave markers. The government troops killed in the battle were collected earlier and buried, perhaps where a stone marks the field of the English. By 4 p.m, government troops were in full control of Inverness, and harassment and punishment of Jacobites was in full flow and would continue for a long time. Prince Charles was, it is said, shocked at the speed and scale of the defeat and had to be restrained from charging onto the field to rally his men. Eventually, he was persuaded to leave, and he and a small group went westward along the River Nairn, eventually spending the night at Gothleck, a cottage belonging to a factor of Simon Fraser, Lord Lovat. Most of the Jacobites who managed to get away from Culloden fled south and west. A day later, at least 1,000 of them gathered at Ruthven Barracks, some 50 miles south. Many were willing to continue the campaign, but by then Prince Charles's confidence was broken, and he sent a message to Ruthven advising the men to disperse and do what they could to save themselves and their families. Even at this stage, the differences between Murray and O'Sullivan were still being aired, for on April the 17th, Lord Murray sent a long detailed letter to the Prince listing all the mistakes of O'Sullivan, which he claimed were the cause of the defeat. One of the enduring issues about the battle is the question of whether either Cumberland or Charles Edward Stuart issued an order that no prisoners should be taken, or in the words of the time, that no quarter should be given. The treatment of wounded Jacobites and of prisoners after the battle certainly suggests that many government soldiers believed this to be the case. The Duke of Cumberland did claim that the Jacobites had issued such an order, which would be taken as indication that government forces should do the same. In support of this, he circulated among his officers a copy of orders signed by Lord George Murray, issued to Jacobite officers. The original of this document is in the Royal Archives. It is said that it clearly shows an insertion into the letter of the words, "To give no quarters to the electors' troops on any account whatsoever." Who made this insertion and when is still a mystery, but there is no doubt that the actions of many, not all, government troops after the battle was very different to the normal practices at that time, and very different to the way in which Charles Edward Stuart had treated prisoners after earlier battles which his army had won. The aftermath to the battle raged on for a long time, and the story of the treatment of prisoners, the trials of leading Jacobites, and the Hanoverian actions against the Scots and Scotland will be told in a separate section. But what if? There are many instances through the 45 Rising where one could question the outcome of a different decision, a different choice, and without doubt selecting the time and particularly the place of this final confrontation, with government forces ranked highly among them. As we have seen, the ground at Culloden was chosen for the battle by the Jacobites, despite it not being favourable to the Jacobite tactics of the Highland charge, which was most effective charging downhill. The ground at Culloden is fairly flat and was boggy at the time. What if the final battle had not been fought on Culloden Moor, but the Jacobite army had crossed the Nairn a few hundred yards away onto more broken ground, or disappeared into the hills, waited until more soldiers joined up with the main force and fought a guerrilla war? Bearing in mind that the Jacobites had run out of money and supplies, and that Inverness was the last town they held, should they nevertheless have chosen a different venue or avoided battle altogether? As we've heard, Charles Edward Stuart fled west after the battle, and the details of his flight, narrow escapes, and eventual departure from Scotland deserves telling. Only 25 years old at the time of the battle, he was to live for many more years before dying in Rome in 1788. How did he deal with his defeat at Culloden? What happened in the remaining years of his life? Another story to tell. And what was the impact of defeat in his faithful Highlanders and other Jacobites, and on the people of Scotland, many of whom had no direct involvement in the Rising? We will consider this in our final episode.